everyone. I just want to let you know it is 1, but apparently there's some construction on the way or something. We have a bunch of people outside waiting to come in, so we're going to get started maybe about 10 minutes late, but we will still finish no later than 2:45. So I just want you to know. For those of you who just gotten in, I just wanted to say that we're going to get started a few minutes late just to give people time to get into this space. So, but we'll still end at about 2:45. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know that people are still registering out in the foyer, and there are other people that are on their way, but I don't want to postpone this too much longer. My name is Lynn Todman. I'm the Executive Director for Population Health at Spectrum Health Lakeland. And I just want to share with you a little bit of information of the context for Community Grand Rounds. One of the things that I had to do when I started at Lakeland about 4 years ago was a community health needs assessment. And in that assessment, we identified pretty significant health disparities between Black and white people in Berrien County. And in fact, in our most recent assessment, we found that the death rate for Blacks in Berrien County is about 30% higher than it is for whites. And the premature death rate, so dying before the age of 75 or younger, is about 66%. So we have these significant differences in death rates, which is a good proxy for overall health in this county. And while things like health behaviors and access to care and access to the resources that you need to be healthy are really important, clear determinants of health, one that was not readily acknowledged, but is really a clear health determinant, is exposure to racism, chronic exposure to racism in the multiple systems that we all have to navigate every day as part of our lives. So CGR comes out of an acknowledgement that these social exposures that African Americans and other people of color have are a key determinant of these high rates of mortality and then chronic diseases that present before then. So that's the context for Community Grand Rounds. We have a couple more speakers coming next year, and over time we're going to evolve. We will continue to talk about racism, but we're also going to talk about some of the other social exposures that undermine people's health, like classism, sexism, and other things that actually harm people in ways that show up in our health. So, so the way we're going to do questions here, I will take questions after Professor Geronimo speaks from the audience, but also I will take them electronically, so you can use your cell phones to hear the instructions for Slido, to kind of open your web browser, put in sli.do, and then there's the event code. I'm going to show this slide again at the end, and you can feel free to submit questions that way as well. So you can take pictures of this if it's easiest to remember. And then the survey evaluation. You will have all gotten, I believe, a survey. A really critical part of this work is to evaluate its efficacy. Is it actually really changing the way people think about racism and other social constructs and their impacts on health? Because as a bigger part of the job that I've been tasked to do is to change the way we think about health and what drives health. It's not just the health system, it's a lot of the stuff, the other stuff that we have to navigate over in our lifetimes. And this survey evaluation tool that we're going to ask you to fill out will help us understand if the way in which we're communicating this information is actually working in terms of getting people to think differently about what shapes health and think differently about the kinds of interventions we have to engage in order to improve health outcomes. So please, please, please fill out the evaluation survey. And so now I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Arlene Geronimo. Now, I have been aware of her work for at least a decade, this concept of weathering that she created, and it's really exciting work. It is now, I think it's fair to say, evolved into a thing that we all know that our social exposures have biological impacts. And so I will invite Dr. Geronimo to come up and get started and speak. And I'll let her do her own bio if she would like to do that. That's enough, she says. Okay. Are you going to go to the...
Yeah, I'm going to go to the podium. Thank you all. Thank you, Lynn. I think that says most of what needs to be said. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health and Institute for Social Research. I've been studying racial inequities in health for 40 years, which was before there was that term. I'm happy to be here to talk about what kind of, from a 40-year stint in this, what is sort of the insights and hindsights and maybe even foresights that I've been able to develop. And so I'll just get started. Some of you may have seen this column by Damon Young in the New York Times oh, I'm sorry, that was the title of the talk. Okay, here's the Damon Young column that was in the New York Times last month. He said, "I pray for murder sometimes." And it goes on, "I've learned how to dodge a bullet, but how do you dodge a stroke?" Now, Damon Young is a young writer in Pittsburgh, and he grew up and later taught high school in a Pittsburgh neighborhood where he knew of many youth who were felled by gunfire. And he writes, "I'm 40 now, and the deaths aren't slowing, but the causes of death are changing. It's been several years since a person I knew was shot to death, but just 2 months since one died of a heart attack, 3 months since one died of cancer, a year since a ruptured aneurysm killed another." And his observations are right in sync with statistics. What this graph shows is the blue line is from people aged 25 to 65, so ages we think of as kind of the prime of life and the healthiest ages. What is sort of the probability of dying by various ages along that course. And so the blue line is the probability for whites in America, the red line is the probability for blacks in America, and the green line is the probability for blacks in the South Side, high poverty areas of the South Side of Chicago. And what I want to point out there is that while we're all understandably very concerned with what happens among youth, whether it relates to homicides or drugs or gun violence or needles, in fact, the inequity between blacks and whites and between the poorest blacks and whites is much larger as you age through middle age. And the main causes of those deaths are chronic disease deaths. So he continues, "Because I'm so familiar with the possibility of violence, I've convinced myself that I can avert it. I can sense when the stillness of the street is a precursor to danger, like the moment before a storm hits and the air adopts a menacing tranquility. I know the shuffle of someone carrying them tools in baggy jeans. But how do you run when cancer decides to call you? How do you duck from a stroke? How do you mean mug a blood clot?" Society owes Mr. Young the answer to these questions. We in the public health and biomedical communities have given what I will call serial shallow efforts towards fulfilling this objective for at least 35 years. To be clear, by shallow, I am not accusing us of lacking in sincerity or dedication. Yet scientific and other stakeholders haven't quite embraced the mission by any means necessary by employing a deep rather than a shallow integration of all the tools and knowledge we now have to promote health equity. And just to give you a brief history, we first identified as a high priority public health national objective to reduce, it was then called health disparities, in the mid-1980s. And each subsequent directive from through, for instance, you're probably familiar with Healthy People goals for the nation that come out every 10 years for what the goals will be for the next 10 years. So that in the most recent one, which was Healthy People 2020, came out in 2010, so it's always 10 years it's looking 10 years in advance. It says, during the past 2 decades, one of Healthy People's overarching goals has focused on disparities. In Healthy People 2000, it was to reduce health disparities among Americans. In Healthy People 2010, it was to eliminate, not just reduce, health disparities. In Healthy People 2020, the goal has expanded even further to achieve health equity, eliminate disparities, and improve the health of the entire population. So these are all very laudable goals, but here we are a hair's width away from 2020, and health inequities have remained entrenched, and in fact, specific health equities, including ones that have been very energetically targeted for reduction or elimination, have grown, and some in absolute as well as in relative terms. So, so here's one example that has been in the news a lot, but I could give you others. This is maternal mortality rates between 1990 and 2015 for the US and for other European countries. And as you can see, the typical experience in Western developed nations is for maternal mortality rates to be going down over this period. But in the US, they've gone up. First they went up a little, and then they started going up much, much higher. And not surprisingly, I wish it were surprising, but not surprisingly, that those excess maternal deaths are not experienced equally by Black and white women. So that the rates for Black women are 3 to 4 times, the national rates are 3 to 4 times the rates for whites. In some cities, the Black rates, New York City, it's 8 times the rate for Blacks as for whites. But the average is about 3.5 to 4 times the rates. So this failure suggests a compelling need to consider new ways to theorize and study health inequities, and new ways to attempt to prevent, reduce, and ultimately eliminate them. What we've done is tended to take individual risk factors, either literally ones that are at the individual level or are just by themselves apart from other concerns. And so over the 40 years that I've been in this business, I've seen these different sort of fashions come in and out, ranging from that there are just essential genetic, racial differences that explain these disparities that has been very well debunked view. Then there were issues of social determinants, but looked at in terms of socioeconomic status, poverty, or education. Then we got interested in demographics and thought about unmarried mothers and teenage mothers, then individual behavior, diet, exercise, smoking, sleeping, for example. We've always, of course, especially in health systems, been concerned with access to prenatal care and also to the technology needed to avert the worst outcomes. We then began thinking about neighborhoods that were often defined by zip codes, which are administrative units that don't necessarily tell you a whole lot about what people experience as their communities. But it has led to a catchy phrase about you can know more about a person's health from their zip code than their genetic code, which has captured a lot of people's attention, and rightfully so, but it doesn't really tell you what's going on in these different communities that would explain it. People have also begun to use the R word, talking mostly about interpersonal racism and everyday unfair treatment. There's a vague knowledge that stress matters. And then we've also thought about epigenetics, which is the ways in which your environment actually changes your epigenetic code. Your DNA will stay the same, but your cell integrity, its ability to suppress, say, cancer genes or to express other genes that aren't healthy can change due to environmental factors. But the fact that we call some of these social determinants doesn't change the fact that we've lost the forest for the trees, I believe. And we've come to think that if you statistically control, say, for income or education or some manner of SES, that you've taken care of all the social differences in life experience between better off and worse off groups. And that's really not the case. And in fact, an analogy I like to use is that running a regression where you put in one socioeconomic variable and race still mattered, which it always does, means it's not something social that's causing the race coefficient to still remain in the presence of the socioeconomic variable, would be akin to a homicide detective ruling out 3 specific white male suspects named John, Charles, and Rupert, and assuming therefore the killer must be a black woman. In one way or another, our notions of risk are select and decontextualized characteristics of individuals, and our go-to interventions are often those that place the onus on individuals to change their behaviors one risk at a time. But in another essay, Damon Young describes a more complicated story about how his mother's behavior was socially constrained and implicated in her early death. And this is in case you're interested, this is in a book of essays he wrote called What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Blacker. And the essay about his mother is called Living While Black Killed Mom. So he talks about remembering the multiple buses Mom would catch to and from work when we didn't have a car, and the overfilled heavy work bag and the purse she'd lug with her, and how the weight of each would make her left shoulder lean like a tree permanently bent by the wind. He tells us that Mom died in 2013, the culmination of an excruciating and tragic 5-year stretch where she, 1, discovered in 2008 that she had COPD, 2, lost her house in the Great Recession to foreclosure, 3, experienced debilitating and mysterious back pain from 2010 to 2012 that the doctors she went to see couldn't diagnose, and then discovered in 2012 that she had stage 4 lung cancer. He goes on to write, I think she might be alive today if she'd been a white woman from Bloomfield. I'm not sure of this. I will never be sure of this. But the thought remains stuck in my mind. Maybe the doctors would have taken her back pain more seriously. Maybe they would have paid more attention to her. Maybe they would have tried a thing they didn't try or recommended a specialist she didn't see. Maybe because Mom was a black woman, her discomfort didn't register the same way it would if her skin were paler and her hair was straighter. Maybe she wouldn't have developed an addiction to nicotine. I'm aware that white people are also susceptible to addiction, but they're not as susceptible. Their world isn't as stress-inducing. The myriad things to get addicted to aren't as easily found where they live, aren't as prominently advertised, and the resources to overcome those sicknesses aren't as hard to find. And when addiction does cripple white communities, as it has with the opioid epidemic, they don't get America's fire and fury as black neighborhoods devastated by crack did. So you could reduce his mother's death to the usual isolated risk factors. She had too much unmanaged stress with all those buses she had to take to work. Clearly, she engaged in some unhealthy individual behavior, smoking. Socioeconomic disadvantage is clear here through the foreclosure of her home, among other things, and taking buses to work. Her poor access to health care and explicit or implicit biases of doctors who didn't take her ailment sufficiently seriously may have played a role in how long it took to diagnose her lung cancer. But I think you would be missing the full and profound ecology that set her early death in motion if we reduced it to those individual factors, as important as any one of them may be. Just as Mr. Young has aged out of gun violence as his most likely cause of death, only to see that what he thought was the light at the end of the tunnel is a Mack truck of chronic disease barreling toward him at a high speed, the members of the public health and medical establishments, we need to stop sort of shining this week's potential silver bullet and instead just mean mug the Mack truck. So toward that end, let me focus for a moment on maternal mortality, which I see as an illustration of something much broader. As many of you are aware from the papers, Erica Garner died at age 27 from a heart attack in the last days of 2017. The very next week, the death of Sergeant Tamisha Dickey, 38, rang in the new year. Their proximity of their deaths to giving birth classified each as a maternal mortality. Along with Serena Williams, Shalon Irving, and Kira Dixon Johnson, they were accomplished Black mothers in their 20s or 30s who died or almost died, in the case of Serena Williams, all the others did die, in the course of little more than a year. These deaths and near deaths are egregious. Medical record reviews in many states are now finding that more than 40% of maternal deaths in recent years were completely preventable with more responsive, perhaps less biased medical care. As noted earlier, US trends are out of line with our Healthy People objectives and also with the trends in other Western countries where maternal death rates have been trending down as US rates have increased. In fact, the US is currently places 50 in the entire world in maternal mortality, where 99% of maternal deaths occur in the high-poverty global south. The WHO has gone as far as to call the US maternal death rate a human rights violation. Beyond reciting these staggering set of mind-numbing statistics, I hope to suggest a way forward. In my perspective, Erica Garner, Tamisha Dickey, Serena Williams, Shalon Irving, and Kira Johnson gave a public face to a structurally rooted biopsychosocial process I have theorized and called weathering. The word weathering is a contronym, a word with opposite meanings. Weathering can be a sign of deterioration and erosion, as in the rock was weathered, but weathering can also be a sign of strength and endurance, as in the concept of, say, the business weathered the recession. For health, it can be both. Think of Damon Young's mother. She did suffer exposures, the foreclosure, bus fumes, stress and strain, smoking, but she also took those buses every day, carried on for years in great pain, supported her family within the structured constraints she faced. She did what she had to do to allow her family to survive and to a degree overcome. She was resilient. She sought medical attention when she became symptomatic. Still, despite her personal and cultural strengths and extraordinary efforts just to live an ordinary life and seek medical help when she needed it, she died too early and too painfully. She died at age 60. It is likely she was weathered. So weathering conceptually is sort of represented in this slide, and what I'm hoping it shows is this idea that weathering theory emphasizes health as a phenotype. Population health is a phenotype, not a genotype. An emergent capacity of human beings that dynamically develops over time in response to multiple nested and contextually fluctuating social, economic, and physical environmental circumstances, behaviors, and biological processes at the molecular and body systems levels. Weathering recognizes health as dynamic across the full life course as biopsychosocial mechanisms link fundamental social causes to population distributions of health, disease, and longevity. Now, some people, I guess I should talk a little here, some of the mechanisms, if you're wondering, for what weathers people. And it's that over time, experience with repeated or chronic stressors and the high effort coping they entail, so both kinds of weathering, induce stress-mediated wear and tear on the neuroendocrine, cardiovascular, metabolic, and immune systems. And the systems become dysregulated and exhausted as cell integrity is violated, leading to accelerated biological aging and increased general health vulnerability. That vulnerability can be expressed in many ways: poor maternal health, chronic inflammation, obesity, depression or other mood disorders, early onset of chronic diseases like hypertension or diabetes, and increased susceptibility to some cancers and to infections. So people have considered this these epigenetic impacts on health, but mostly have looked in the first 3 years of life, or fetal life in the first 3 years of life, and to some extent in adolescence. The idea there is that epigenetic changes that happen in the womb and in early childhood could have enduring effects on health trajectories, resulting in increased health vulnerability for members of marginalized groups. And explicating these possible pathways has received and should have received great attention over the last several years as scientific understanding of epigenetics and the developmental origins of disease and the enduring physiological impacts of adverse childhood experience has grown. However, the point I want to make today is we live most of our lives outside of developmental windows. Less studied or understood, weathering theory considers how health vulnerability can increase across the young adult through middle ages as family leadership roles and responsibilities are assumed. And this can happen by exposure during those times to persistent and multiple stressors, not just stressors in the womb, not just stressors in the first 3 years of life, but ongoing cumulative stressors. And the high effort coping they entail, which, as I said, can accelerate cellular aging, dysregulate and exhaust neuroendocrine, cardiovascular, metabolic, and immune systems, and lead to the early onset of chronic disease, health-induced disability, and excess death. So through chronic and repeated actuation of the physiological stress response system, our bodies undergo long-term exposure to stress hormones that over time, as I said, dysregulate or even exhaust critical body systems and accelerate aging. So the weathering conceptual model then is concerned with the physiological implications of historically structured differences by race in lived experience, exposure to stressors, and access to coping resources. It is about how race becomes biology. And so one simple way to think about it, and how I first started thinking about, well, how can I test this, or how can I see if this is happening, is that you could say the chronic stressors inherent in living in a race-conscious and unequal society may cause blacks or other marginalized groups. Any of us can weather, and we have done studies of various different marginalized groups, found evidence of weathering. So it's not that only African Americans weather, but African Americans are more likely to be under the kinds of stress and to do the kinds of coping that weather people, and we see that in their much worse health outcomes. So you sort of expect, if weathering were true, where it was a real phenomenon, you would expect that members of marginalized groups, and again, I'm going to continue to talk specifically about blacks in America, but you can generalize to other groups as well, to experience the morbidity and mortality of whites who are significantly older. And so we first studied this in looking at a single stress-related disease, hypertension prevalence. And the weathering hypothesis would predict that age trajectories of hypertension prevalence through middle age would be steeper for black than white Americans, with a wider racial gap in hypertension prevalence in middle age than at younger ages. And in fact, that's exactly what we found. And we've actually redone this in several cohorts, starting with a cohort from 1976 to 1980, and we're just finishing up a cohort from recent years, and this is our next recent cohort where I have the results to show you. But what you see here is that same sort of pattern we saw with death to men, which is that in the teens and early 20s, differences between blacks and whites, this is women, are very small, but they begin to enlarge, and then they enlarge, and then they enlarge, so that they're much bigger by middle age than they are in youth. And they're also much bigger than they are in older ages, but that's probably related to selection and the fact that many of the most weathered people have died and are no longer in the samples. And in terms of reproductive health, while the differences are larger after the reproductive years, you see that they're beginning to increase around age 20 and are somewhat sizable, all statistically significant, by age 30 and certainly by age 40. So if we think of those as reproductive ages, you can see weathering can impact reproductive health, even if you haven't weathered as badly as you will 10 or 20 years later. So one reason the specific mothers I named have caught our attention is their tragedies defy many of our most cherished beliefs, whether as public health professionals or simply Americans. None of the Black mothers featured in the news fits the conventional wisdom on health disparities. They were not stereotypes. None of them were poor, welfare dependent, or teenage mothers. Many were indisputably fit. Oh, sorry. Serena Williams, for example, but also Kira Dixon Johnson was a marathon runner, a licensed pilot, an avid skydiver. She spoke 5 languages and was an international businesswoman. All of them made active contributions to their communities. Sergeant Tamisha Dickey was a dedicated veteran police officer. Erica Garner became a tireless advocate for racial justice after her father was a victim of homicide, as I'm sure you all know, at the hands of a New York City police officer. Her father's dying words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying cry for the Black Lives Matter movement, and Erica, although initially apprehensive, became a major force in the movement for police accountability. Shalon Irving was a PhD-trained member of the Epidemiology Intelligence Service at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And among the tragic ironies of her death, Shalon was professionally dedicated to promoting health equity. Yet her own body may have suffered from the same structural violence she was working to name and undo. Now, we don't know how representative the specific mothers profiled are, but they're not anomalies. I wanted to show you this, which goes contrary to entrenched popular belief. This is maternal mortality rates by the age of mother and race. And so the first set of bars, each different color is a different age, and the first set is for non-Hispanic white women. The second set is for non-Hispanic Black women, and the third set is just the overall in the US. And so what I think is glaringly clear is, first of all of them age of maternal death increases with age, but not in the same ways. For the overall group and for the white group, there's very little increases until you get to about age 35, at which point there's a real jump, but it's still, those highest risk ages are about the same risk as the lowest risk ages, which are the teen ages for Blacks. And this is not controlling for any of those SES factors, but we know that older mothers are likely to be more educated as a group, to be of higher socioeconomic position, to have greater access to health services, and greater likelihood of being married. And yet they are more likely to suffer maternal death than those in their teens. At the age Erica Garner died, Black mothers have more than twice the rate of maternal mortality as Black teen mothers, and 4 times the rate of white teen mothers. At the ages Shalon Irving, Serena Williams, and Tamisha Dickey and Kira Johnson died or almost died. Black mothers as a group experienced 5 times greater rates of maternal mortality than Black teen mothers, and more than 9 times the rate of not white teen mothers. Over the same time period, maternal mortality increased. The proportion of first births at these more high-risk ages increased. And so in 1995, they accounted for a little less than a quarter of births, but by 2018, they accounted for almost 40% of all births. And moreover, the distribution of causes of maternal death have also shifted away or towards weathering types of conditions. So what you see here is each colored bar represents a time period from 1987 in the first one to 2010 in the last one. And then each set of bars is a different cause of death. And so while in the 80s, hemorrhage was the predominant cause of death, of maternal death, it's gone down quite substantially over time, whereas what has gone up and what accounts for this huge upsurge in maternal mortality in the United States are deaths due to cardiovascular conditions, other medical conditions, sort of infections to a smaller extent, and other stress-related chronic medical diseases. So circumstantially, these changing distributions by age, race, and cause of death fit weathering. Women are postponing childbearing to older ages, away from the lowest risk ages to ages where they are more likely to suffer clinical or preclinical chronic disease. And what I wanted to show here was it's not, maternal mortality is very striking, but it's actually a low risk event. But for every woman who has died a maternal death these days, there's about 70,000 who have a near-death experience that's due to some chronic extreme disease during delivery. And what you see is even those what's called severe maternal morbidities have gone up in lockstep over the years. So it's not only who dies, it's also who's not well, and to begin with. Okay. But I want to say that, part of how we've gotten here is that we have blind spots and we haven't kind of put this all together. So for Kira Johnson and Tamisha Dickey, who came to their birthing experiences without any diagnosable pre-existing conditions, their tragic stories get described as some combination of bad luck, acts of God, and medical error, perhaps influenced by implicit racial biases of their healthcare providers. And there's certainly quite a bit of evidence in their cases, especially Kira Johnson's, that medical unresponsiveness is likely to have played a very large role in her death. But the weathering hypothesis suggests that long before they entered the hospital, their lives in a racialized and unequal society may have set them up for that kind of medical error to make such a life-threatening difference to the outcome of their birth. Now, so we kind of dismiss Kira and Tamisha because we say, who could have known? It must have been an act of God. There was no sign of anything. But Erica Garner and Serena Williams are also called special cases precisely because they had pre-existing conditions. So it's sort of either way, nobody's really thinking through what's really going on here. Erica suffered from an enlarged heart. Serena had a history of blood clots. It's possible, even likely, that in part or whole, their pre-existing conditions were measures of their lived experience as Black women in the United States and its lifelong wear and tear on their health. There are vivid and biologically plausible pathways through which chronic stressors could have contributed to Erica Garner's enlarged heart in her 20s or Serena Williams' blood clots in her 30s. We know that physiological stress response activation leads our veins to constrict and increase blood pressure. If we're subject to chronic stressors, our veins become hardened over time. Damage to the veins and arteries lead immune cells to cluster with fats, proteins, and glucose and build up atherosclerotic plaque. And muscles in the left ventricle of the heart can enlarge and thicken. That could have explained Erica Garner's enlarged heart. In addition, those clogged circulatory systems can lead to thrombosis or embolism, perhaps that played a role in Serena Williams' history of blood clots. And I want to highlight that we understand this pathway through hardened arteries and plaque buildup, et cetera, but we mostly think about it in terms of what we eat or whether we exercise. And while those, of course, do matter, I'm not suggesting otherwise, I think many people miss that being subjected to chronic stressors and to high effort coping with chronic stressors also sets that physiology in motion, and will not necessarily be affected in a positive or negative way, but by just eating correctly or making sure to exercise. So many of us, I think, have become blinded to the lifelong plight of these very accomplished women because we simply saw them as playing by the rules and in many ways winning. We didn't understand they could be weathering. Or as Serena Williams' husband Alexis ruminated after watching her recover from a near-death experience shortly after giving birth to their daughter, consider for a moment that your body is one of the greatest things on this planet and you're trapped in it. Among others, weathering raises the question of whether we might be more successful at promoting population health equity if we focus on explicating the health costs of tenacity and hope in the context of racially structured constraints. Childbearing itself is an expression of hope for self, for family, for community, and the resistance to surrendering hope for a satisfying future, even in the face of structural constraints. And the weathering effects of tenacious high-effort coping with structural inequity are now suggested by a range of studies on a range of outcomes, including metabolic syndrome, hypertension, obesity, diabetes, accelerated cellular aging, and cardiovascular disease. I hope we can all agree that no one should have to increase their risk of metabolic syndrome, hypertension, obesity, accelerated cellular aging, or maternal death because they persevered against structurally racist odds, or simply because they tried to lead an ordinary life like Damon Young's mom or Tamisha Dickey, or because they strove for excellence like Serena Williams and Kira Dixon Johnson, or for justice like Shalon Irving and Erica Garner, and just last week, Elijah Cummings. In the weeks before her death, Erica Garner described the stress, exhaustion, and frustration that was exacted of her activism. She said, "I'm struggling now with the stress and everything." She said, "This thing, it beats you down. The system beats you down to where you can't win." Or as her sister, Emerald Snipes Garner, described a week after Erica's death, on what also turned out to be the day Sergeant Tamisha Dickey died, "It was like a Jenga. They were taking out pieces, ripping her apart." One way to think about weathering is as a life or death Jenga. The scaffolding appears strong as blocks are eliminated. It remains upright as the first pieces are removed one by one. To all appearances, it is standing strong until the removal of that last fateful block exposes the many weaknesses of the interior and the tower collapses. For the mothers profiled here and many others like them, I'm suggesting they may have entered pregnancy with weathered biological systems that suffered weaknesses and vulnerabilities more often characteristic of women who are substantially older. Some of these had been identified as diagnosed conditions: the enlarged heart for Erica Garner, the history of blood clots for Serena Williams. But for all of these mothers, even those who didn't have a diagnosable condition, the physiological stress of pregnancy and childbirth may have been that last fateful force, sort of the unwitting stress test and tipping point that when superimposed on weathering or prematurely aging bodies, ripped them apart. The weathering framework provides a lot of fertile ground for continued research to test possible pathways. We can come up with all kinds of studies, just looking at this one diagram alone, and certainly we should and are continuing to do so. But I want to highlight that my experience suggests we need to make researchers in the social sciences and the humanities, along with community partners, as the central protagonists in this effort, to help ensure our hypotheses are grounded in lived experience and grasp the real-world meaning of our data. We need to stay mindful that, as Van Jones says of the environmental movement, those who are hit first and worst should not be the last and least at arriving at solutions. And that can be the difference between just finding some statistical association with health in your zip code and understanding what's going on in those communities that where things are worse, and what's going on in the communities where things are better, to arrive at actual ideas for policies and interventions and to address unmet needs. Unfortunately, academia, the tech and pharmaceutical industries, and biomedical research appears to be veering in a different direction, providing huge resources, prestige, and potential profits for doing statistical analyses of big data sets and exaggerating the promise of personalized medicine while being blind to how speculative it is, and that to the extent it does advance, its implementation is more likely to increase health inequity than decrease it because of a combination of market forces and entrenched social bias. So we who have been constant gardeners dedicated to promoting health equity, who affirm that Black Lives Matter, now have, as I said earlier, enough hindsight and insight and foresight that oversights really can no longer be tolerated or are really not excusable. We could have claimed ignorance 30 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, but we can't anymore. If we follow the clues to the importance of historically structured lived experience to health, we can be led to policy and intervention approaches worth implementing and evaluating that are weathering informed and speak to recognition and restorative justice. While it is beyond the scope of today's talk, I'm going to mention a few of these that to greater or lesser extent are being embraced in particular locales. So one is simply the idea of having health equity as a consideration in all policies. Sometimes people talk about writing health impact statements. And there are some obvious examples like housing policies, economic policies. Certainly we need to think about how those impact different populations differentially in ways that could lead to health inequities. But there's also other things, and I picked a couple that are pretty high profile lately, which is the changing of immigration violations from a civil offense to a criminal offense, and thus the using of militarized raids to round up people as if they were cattle in some instances. We did a study long before what was happening at the border now with child separations of pregnant women in Iowa before and after a completely surprise, very militarized, very violent raid on a meatpacking plant in 2008. And so it provided kind of a natural experiment for us and an easily measured outcome, which is the birth outcome. And we found for Latina mothers, not only those living in the raid or living near the raid or related to someone in the raid, not only those throughout Iowa who were undocumented, but including those who were American citizens born in America as well as naturalized, who were at no risk of deportation themselves, that their rate of low birth weight increased 25% in the 6 months after the raid compared to same 6-month period for any of the, I think it was 9 years preceding the raid and several years after. And this did not happen to the white women in Iowa, only to the Latinas. There are certainly plausible biological pathways through which complex and inflammatory and endocrine responses are known to affect birth adversely. But what I think is also interesting, besides the very quantifiable impact on babies, was that those processes were set in motion by a cue in many cases to people who were not at risk and nowhere near that Latinos aren't valued in our current society. Similar study found the same thing for Muslim women in California after 9/11. So again, these are women living in California. They weren't in New York. They weren't subjected directly to the blast. And yet, there's the way that their sense of belonging or cultural affirmation or identity safety or just safety was threatened by knowing how people sort of turned on Muslims and blamed all Muslims for the acts of a few, may have been why we saw this finding in both studies of the group that at that historical moment is being particularly denigrated has worse birth outcomes. Another thing that many people are in local areas around the country are trying to do, and you may be doing some of this here, is looking at those segregated communities and investing in those people and places. And so there's a concept now you may have heard of called wellness-based development, which is how to improve those zip codes in ways that are equitable, that the benefits go to the original residents as much or more than they go to, say, gentrifiers. It's very different from the first round of kind of trying to revitalize urban areas, which involved making it great tourist spots, demolishing public housing, spreading the people who live there to the winds. Now there is this idea that you need to take this high road revitalization with equity and environmental justice components, and that to do so you can leverage government programs, local anchor institutions, which are often health systems, and local community organizations and residents to do so. Another thing that there's a push for is recognizing how blacks bear a much higher burden of living in energy inefficient homes in the United States, and that programs to provide weatherization assistance will probably promote health better than the programs that we have that give them a little assistance to pay their bills, and will have much more enduring effects. And that they're also a critical step toward restorative justice at the same time. And lastly, I want to say, while it's easy and imperative that we think about the health harms that have been done in high poverty and residentially high segregated communities, we also have to now recognize that some health harms to the marginalized are actually more likely to be activated in numerically diverse integrated settings, including ones that are relatively economically advantaged. Our classrooms and hospitals, the elite professional tennis circuit, if we're thinking of Serena Williams, the CDC, if you think of Shalon Irving, the United States Congress, if you think about Elijah Anderson, as well as our everyday classrooms, hospitals, workplaces, clinics. We have to think about that socioeconomic status is not merely an indicator of what material resources or education or institutional access you have. It's also the lived experience of acquiring those resources or access in our racialized system. So the final set of general idea of interventions I think we need to think about is what I call addressing the diversity problem, kind of building toward a beloved global community, not only statistical integration. So we need to focus on the E and I in DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, in our schools, clinics, businesses, and government agencies. While we often use all three letters, it's much easier to just focus on increasing statistical diversity than improving and promoting equity and inclusion. And remember, when you think back to the women in the ice raid or the women in California after 9/11, there are some, when your social identity is threatened, you become vigilant in a physiological way. And so not having equity and inclusion, even in elite integrated settings, can activate weathering processes. I think we need to have cultural humility and structural competence in medical education. I've also started to develop something I call Jedi public health, which I think can be applied at multiple levels using multiple media and in multiple settings, and some of it is incredibly cost-effective. For example, the general idea behind Jedi public health is that policies and interventions that remove and replace discrediting cues in everyday settings would disrupt weathering, or at least not add another weathering experience. And so there's been a lot of work in the educational literature, especially around women who go into the STEM professions, or who mostly don't go into the STEM professions, where people have found that interventions that are as simple as changing the posters in a high school science classroom from posters of Star Trek to posters of nature, so they're both sort of scientifically oriented. But the women in the classes with the nature posters perform better in clinical trials, and actually randomly assigned trials. The women perform better and also feel more motivated and more likely to persist and want to do well in that class and persist in STEM classes. There are ways you could apply that to any group that's marginalized, how hard is it to change posters in a classroom? And while that alone isn't going to change entrenched disparities, you can imagine if it's done broadly enough, it would start to have positive recursive processes. In the case of the women in STEM, if they're more motivated and getting better grades, they're going to continue in STEM. If they are with the Star Trek posters and feel alienated, they aren't. A similar study was done with just SAT scores, where, again, in a randomized controlled trial, people were assigned either to checking off the demographic questions, whether you're female, black, white, Asian, whatever, before they took the test or after the test. None of them had any idea. I mean, this is how sensitive we are to cues and primes, to our social and stereotype social identity. But for those women who ticked off that they were women at the end of the test, they on average scored several hundred points higher than the ones who ticked it off at the beginning. And one researcher went as far as to have the primes be about whether the girls were women, were female, highlighting that their social identity was female, or Asian. And they found even down to girls as young as 5, obviously not using SAT tests, but other performance measures, cognitive performance measures. They found that if you primed them, again, through random assignment, if you primed them to remember that they were Asian, they did much better than if you primed them to remember they were girls. So, again, how costly is it to change where you get your demographic information on a high-stakes test? And how this also relates to health is what people have also found through MRI studies, is what happens when you are in a kind of prime to be aware of the stereotype threat against your group, girls in science, for example, where, again, a lot of the work has been done. What that does is it starts recruiting effective neural networks rather than cognitive ones, as you kind of stress out and worry about fulfilling the prophecy that you're not as smart as a boy, or whatever the group comparison is. And that the recruitment of those effective neural networks is also what sets physiological stress reactions in motion. And so what I'm saying is, in all the settings we're in, big and small, there are cues. Some of them hammer us over the head, like an ice raid, and others of them are just a poster on a wall. But if you're subjected to those cues everywhere chronically, as well as to the threats that come from environmental injustice, living in polluted areas, not having access to good food, or crime or violence, or the threats of militarized raids, or not having heat during the winter, or not having air conditioning during heat waves. You add it all together, and that's where weathering comes from. And none of those things will be solved through individual behavior alone, medical care alone. Medical care may switch a weathered body from dying early to not dying early, or being a maternal death or a near maternal death, but it doesn't get at all those cues and settings. But it still can be very much part of the solution, including thinking about how, through medical education, what you put on the walls in your offices. There are just all kinds of things about whether a clinic setting or hospital setting feels inviting and like everybody belongs. So there's something we all can do to deal with that aspect of weathering. Anyway, I'm sure I'm way out of time, so I'll stop there, and I'm happy to talk about any of these ideas more. But weathering clearly has roots in our racist history, many of which we continue as a society to cultivate, but they can be disrupted, and we all have to work to do that. Thank you.
Thank you all. Can you advance this slide?
What?
Can you advance this slide?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so it looks like we don't have any slide questions yet, but I did have a question about, well, I wanted to make a statement, because Jerry Price is not here, but he's one of our colleagues at Lakeland, an African-American man. I don't know his age, but I would say mid-40s or so. And he actually chronicled for us the loss of 22 friends between the ages of 35 and 50 over a 14-month period. Mm-hmm. And only 3 of them died from episodes of violence. All the rest, one was completed suicide, but the rest were chronic diseases. So that just speaks to the point that you made at the top of your presentation. But are there any questions for Dr. Dramas? Oh, there are questions on there? I don't know, they're not showing up on. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. So one question is, does the research make clear the interaction, does someone want to read out that first question?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Yeah, that was hard. Does the research make clear the intersection between physiological changes experienced due to trauma and those due to weathering?
Yes, is the short answer. There's a lot of evidence that trauma, adverse childhood experiences, et cetera, precipitate weathering in a variety of ways, including, if it does happen in a young age, changing brain architecture in various ways that then make you more likely to have stress reactions, which is very unfortunate and perverse. Yes, absolutely trauma, and having trauma-informed curricula, et cetera, dealing with veterans or others who are suffering PTSD, all of that would be a way to try and disrupt weathering. What I'm also suggesting, obviously, is that it doesn't have to be something we would label as trauma. It could just be the everyday of, having to take the buses to work and having your house foreclosed on you, and having doctors not be able to figure out what's causing your pain until you're in stage 4 cancer.
Yeah. Can you talk, I think you might have spoken a little bit about this, but can you talk more about discrediting cues and where we see them and how we can recognize them?
They're everywhere. And they're big and small, and some are clearly recognizable, but others, I certainly never thought when I ticked off the woman box when I was taking a math test that I had now been primed to remember I was, in the class of people stereotyped for not being good at math. So many of them are just completely under the radar, and we have to think through what they are. But they're everywhere. They're in policies. They're in as I said, in classrooms, workplaces. They're in bigger things like the fact, that one neighborhood gets so much less, more foreclosures and more tax foreclosures. One of the problems we have in Detroit is the massive number of tax foreclosures. It wasn't that people hadn't paid their mortgage bills. It was that the taxes, they had been subject to subprime lending and all the evils of the 90s and early 2000s on the part of bankers primarily. But they also, what they couldn't keep paying was the taxes on properties that had lost their value but were still being taxed at the old rates, as they had lost their jobs often due to the recession, or their pensions, or other means of support. So
one cue I can think of is when a hiring agent refers to fit. Mm-hmm. Good fit with an organization. That's cue for. That's one of the cues that I'm familiar with.
And with those kind of things, which some people might call microaggressions, what's important to remember, people get caught in debates. Well, did the person mean it? Are you just being too sensitive? That's irrelevant. It's the fact that we live in a society where it's perfectly plausible that the person meant it, whether or not that particular one did. Mm-hmm. And so then you have the slight to yourself, and if you have already been a product of weathering, you also may have a lower threshold for dealing with those kind of slights, and you may also just be thrown into a state of rumination about, well, did they mean it, didn't they mean it, is that what they meant? Does that mean he's a person, are we being shown the right houses, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this endless everyday set of just life processes that are kind of enmeshed in our society that trigger these stress reactions, and would all probably come under this category called cue, but that word doesn't quite capture just how profound the effects are. Obviously, things we see on television, the movies, when you hear about there aren't enough black actors in the movies, all the big data set algorithms we're using now to decide all kinds of decisions have these cues and things embedded in them. I don't know if any of you have read a book called Weapons of Mass Destruction, but it very well lays out the ways that the way we've been going to more and more fancy algorithms as a way to be efficient in certain kinds of decision making and sorting, the less equitable we've become, that all our implicit biases and explicit biases get put into the math, and then you can't even see it to name it.
See it all, like cues, a lot of cues in media.
A lot of cues in media, absolutely.
So one person asked, what specific steps can we take as clinicians to reduce unintended racism in our practice?
Obviously, just knowing you might have unintended racism is one step that kind of opens you up and should make you not, I think one of the problems people get defensive and get into these arguments, well, I didn't mean that, or I'm not a racist, but the idea is these things are happening everywhere, and it's not just that it's implicit in your head, but it's just implicit in how we all talk about things or structure things. So one part is just to take a deep breath and realize you probably are, like any of us, helping to proliferate racism, even though you absolutely don't know it or want to do it. And then trying to think about, well, what are the ways? So what some ways physicians can do, for instance, I'm working on a task force in New York City on the maternal mortality deaths, and we found that there were no crash carts available in maternity wards because people just sort of thought maternity wards were places you go do this natural thing that healthy young women do called give childbirth. And so the idea that people might have a need for a cart either for hemorrhaging or for a cardiac event just wasn't even thought about. And some of the people who, I've been involved in medical record reviews of some of the women who died in New York City, And many of them, if there had been a crash cart right there, it would have made the difference between life and death. And so when I said 40% of the maternal deaths are clearly preventable, that's the kind of thing I meant, that there's a simple step a health system or a physician or clinician can take that would have made the life or death difference. And while didn't change their weathering if they died rather than lived, imagine how the loss of a mother, the loss of a wife, the loss of a daughter, exacerbates the weathering of the people left behind. So there would be broader ripple effects.
Okay. I have a lot of questions here, and
Okay.
just related to maternal mortality. I thought I saw something here. Well, I'll just go back to the top. Does the priming of parts of identity, and leading to worse, I think this is a typo, does the priming of parts of identity and leading to worse outcomes manifest itself in healthcare when providing demographic info during intake and registration?
When what?
When providing demographic information during intake and registration.
Right. There hasn't been any literal randomized controlled trial to test that, but there's no reason not to think that it could. And it's not costly to switch when you ask the demographic information. So for all the reasons that happens when you're taking tests. And there's a variety of ways where people, there's a whole part of medical sociology where they show how many times people are very self-conscious about that they're women or uneducated or a minority group or some stereotyped group, and that the doctor doesn't seem friendly with it. And I've actually seen videotapes of the same doctor treating two different patients and completely unaware. None of this is intentional. But one of them, who was a white woman, young woman, he listened to very openly. He literally opened up his, arms. I don't mean he hugged her or anything, just in his chair. They had a long talk. He got her whole medical history, and she left with what she had came for, and with other things that she needed. It was good. And then that very same doctor in the very same clinic, in the very same room, in the very same chair, sat there kind of like this when he was talking with a Latina patient who was somewhat obese and very dark looking, and who had gotten hurt in a motorcycle accident. She was a biker. So you can imagine all the different stereotypes that may have elicited. And she left. He never took much of a medical history. He wanted it over with quickly. He didn't seem welcoming. And he didn't even give her any of the pain meds that she needed because of the pain of this really grotesque leg injury. And so, again, I doubt that physician actually knew he was doing those two things, and he might have even, some physicians think racial profiling is actually a good thing that can help them cut to the chase. Not true. They cannot substitute for real medical histories and having an open mind. This may be, Kira Dixon Johnson. There's a lawsuit happening now about her death, and as the facts are coming out, it seems pretty clear that there was tremendous medical error, including being unresponsive to the fact that she was bleeding and in a lot of pain, and things were just not right for hours and hours and hours. And in fact, her mother-in-law is very famous, and when they realized after the death that she was related to this woman, they went to her and said, if we had known she was your daughter-in-law, she wouldn't have died. And they thought that was an apology. Of course, no one should have to die, whether they have a rich, famous relative or not. So,
yeah. So another question kind of related that, is the OBGYN community reacting to the recent maternal mortality of the aforementioned high-profile people, and what action could it spark? So basically, people whose death kind of made it to the New York Times, how is the OBGYN community reacting to that?
Public health departments are reacting to it, and I've been invited to participate in one way or another, as I said, in task force that are meant to go through every medical record of a maternal death and try to figure out what's happening and what they could do differently. And I think OBGYNs are receptive to that information, especially when it's something simple, like get a crash cart. If you decide, this is what happened with Kira Johnson, they decided she really needed an ultrasound, but they didn't take her to have the ultrasound for 10 hours, at which point she had completely internally bled to death. So I think they're reacting. They don't know what to do, but they're listening, and some are participating in these task forces. The task forces tend to be a combination of people in the public health agencies, community partners, and physicians and other clinicians.
Yeah, and I believe we have something similar to that in Michigan. Nikki, I think you've been a part of that. Yeah. So switching to education, someone asked, so does years of sexism throughout our learning environment contribute to lower secondary education outcomes?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Oh, there you go.
Absolutely.
Okay.
There's research on that. Dealing with stereotype threat in education is probably the most advanced in the field of actually having done studies, and again, often randomized controlled studies, which social scientists don't often get to do, and so there's pretty clear evidence in education.
As well. And then someone asked, are you working on a book on weathering yet? This is groundbreaking. You've written many, many articles.
What?
Well, it just flipped on me. Are you working on a book on weathering yet? This is groundbreaking. But I think you've written many articles on weathering.
Right, though they're not so much. People have been asking me that very question now for a while, and so I'm seriously considering it. I write journal articles, but I understand, not books, but I understand very few people read journal articles, and it's not getting to all the right people. So I think that a compelling case has been made that maybe there's a place for a book about weathering. Whether I'm capable of writing one is another, is another question.
You have some helpers here. Someone asked, keeps flipping here, is there any research based on biofeedback and interrupting the poor health outcomes loop?
Well, first of all, there's no reason to believe it wouldn't, given that it does in other populations where it's been looked at. But one of my concerns about weathering is the extent to which some people who have wanted to do things about it turn first to, well, let's have meditation in the schools, or let's, do individual mindful practices. I'm not against that, and I'm not saying that won't have some positive impact, but at the same time, these cues, these assaults, these aggressions, micro and macro, are everywhere, and they're also affected by the constraints on people's lives. And so expecting individuals, again, to avoid weathering because they meditate or become mindful, I think is just asking too much. And speaking of efficiency and equity, I think that's both inequitable and inefficient. When we can change things in our context, in our environment, and our posters on the walls and things like that, that would affect all the people in that setting, why are we instead having everybody meditate? Sorry.
Right.
Again, I'm not opposed to it, and I think it can only do positive things. But
you're talking,
it's not
we're talking about the structural
It's not going to end
phenomenon.
weathering.
At
alone.
a population level, you need more structural interventions.
Right.
So compliance to SIDS safe to sleep recommendations is very poor in the Black community. I don't know if that's true, but someone said that. How can that be improved?
Wait, could you say that again?
SIDS, compliance to SIDS safe to sleep recommendations.
It's very hard to adhere, I'll say, I won't say comply, I'll say adhere to sleep recommendations under a lot of conditions that people in poor communities find themselves. For one thing, if you're having to work 2 or 3 jobs, you may not have that 6 or 7 hours stretch, even if you could just calm down and sleep. People are in overcrowded housing, often rat-infested housing, or too cold or too hot housing, and then these ruminations and affecting or recruiting effective networks doesn't just go to bed when you tell it to. In fact, nighttime is one of the times you may ruminate the most. It can be loud or noisy. You could have a militarized raid. Now, I'm not talking so much about the ICE raids, but there's a lot of evidence that part of the war on drugs involved a lot of militarized raids in people's homes in the middle of the night, which more often than not, either targeted the wrong people, or even if they were targeting, by some definition, the right people, they were living in, say, apartment houses or public housing or places where lots of other people were disrupted and sometimes even killed in the line, with a stray bullet. So it's just really hard to think about sleep as something you can just choose to do. I can't choose. I want to sleep much more, But there are some things, you can do things to help. You can be aware that some things will make it harder, but you can't turn off all the sirens in your neighborhood. You can turn off your TV or turn off your cell phone so you don't have that bright light in your eyes, but you can't, there's a lot of things beyond your control to affect, and you can't stop ruminating. Think about Erica Garner. Everywhere she went, they were looping, restaurants everywhere, looping the footage of her father being killed right in front of her eyes. I mean, you don't get to turn all that stuff off as easily as some people think by aromatherapy or turning off, the TV.
Yeah, I think, and I don't know much about this, I think they were talking about a protocol that is used to keep babies from dying in their bed.
Babies?
Yes.
The SIDS. Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
That's okay. That's all right.
I thought you were talking about...
Yeah, that protocol, but in any case.
Absolutely. Those sleep protocols have demonstrably saved infant lives. They're not, I'm less convinced about the people who argue that, babies can't sleep in your bed with you or with anybody else, which many cultures do, and many people for financial reasons don't have a choice but to do. But certainly putting the baby in the right position wherever he or she sleeps does save lives. And there's no reason people can't all be told this. It's not like that's a real high-tech
I think
solution.
They were implying that this protocol isn't adhered to as often in Black communities. Recently, Benton Harbor and St. Joseph were ranked as having the 67th largest economic disparity in the U.S., now ranked 8th. Why the huge rise? I don't know that. Okay, so my biostatistician is actually frowning at this one, so I'm wondering. I'm not sure that we're equipped to answer that question. The next one, oh boy. I'm sorry. We'll just take a couple more. If I can get this to, there we go. Isn't it a part of the problem that the high-profile deaths that made it to the New York Times, but the deaths of ordinary people are not reported on?
I think that is a problem, and many more of the maternal deaths are to so-called ordinary people. But there has been, I think, a very positive thing that's come up from those high-profile deaths is it has made many people realize it's not as simple as you shouldn't be a teen mom, or you shouldn't have children when you're poor, or or you shouldn't be an unmarried mom. We've had all these just demographic types of risk factors that people, that was all part of a broader narrative about a sort of underclass or a pathological culture, or people just not trying hard enough or being resilient. And weathering has always been clear by that second meaning of weathering, that part of weathering is the resilience, is the, banging your head against a wall when there's a wall there. And so what is nice about those women being profiled is they couldn't just be dismissed as, well, they shouldn't have had a baby. They were all doing exactly what we tell women they should do.
Right. So there is a question here about white racism and why we're not addressing it directly, and I would invite that person to come to me immediately after the event, because we're actually not, this question makes me think of individualized or interpersonal racism, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about structural stuff that's embedded in the systems and institutions that we navigate every day, and I'd be happy to answer that question. I thought I'd said it kind of clearly before, but maybe not, but I'm happy to talk more about that. And I don't know if you want to talk about it, but I was going to try and end on a different note. So ending on a positive note, how can I advocate for welcoming, respectful health care? I thought that would be an easy one.
That would be. I'm easier going to the dark side than the uplifting.
Okay, you want to take on the one about the about racism? Why aren't we talking about eradicating white racism?
I think some easier. Of dealing with the structural things is probably more in our purview, but also what is true is that the racism that has become much clearer over the last few years and been allowed to affect policy such as at the border or find people on both sides type of rhetoric, that can only be exacerbating weathering in the populations subject to weathering. And so I'm not suggesting we don't need to care about explicit racism, but what I am suggesting, and especially in these years, but what I am suggesting is for all of us who honestly don't believe and aren't explicit racists, who are even dedicating our lives toward, making a more equitable world, doesn't mean we're not participating in the maintenance of a range of structures and practices that themselves activate weathering processes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think it's about that time, and we're going to thank Dr. Geronimus for being here and sharing her insights. Thank you. Evaluation. Oh, what do we do now? Yeah, so we often, no, I don't, because somebody else flipped it for me. Thank you. So we often get the question, what do we do now? We have a lot of people in our community who are, want to become engaged in this work in a productive way. And so we do have Debbie Irving. Many of you were at Debbie Irving's event a few weeks ago, and she has a 21-day racial equity habit building challenge that you can engage in. If you go to the CGR website at Lakeland, you can read about that challenge. And it essentially means every day for 21 days, do something, read an article, engage in a conversation, challenge somebody on something that will help kind of reframe our understanding of, racism, to kind of participate in that 21-day challenge. And then also we're having a community read of Debbie's book, Waking Up White. And these are the dates. They're going to be hosted in 2 libraries, St. Joe Library and Ben Harbor Library and First Presbyterian Church on these days. That information is also available on our CGR website. And is there another slide after that? There you go. Stay connected. And I will say our next event is actually going to take place in April. We have Dr. Michael Osborn, who's a cardiologist, researcher at Harvard School of Medicine, who's actually doing some really interesting research linking social phenomena like exposure to noise and cardiovascular health. And so kind of some of these environmental factors that some communities are disparately exposed to, and how's that showing up in obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular health. And so his work will really kind of speak to the actual physiological mechanisms, the stuff that's going on in the body to actually cause those things to present. So, and we have lots of other stuff coming up for next year as well. So, but in any case, thank you. Stay warm, stay dry. And we'll see you around. Oh, and my evaluator is saying, please fill out the evaluation so we can know if what we're doing is making a difference. Please, please, please fill out the evaluation. Thank you.